knows everything, but everyone knows something no one else knows, including you. Welcome to the other side of things. I'm your host, Dr. Michael DeMaria, and for 35 years, I've been a guide of the soul. On the other side of things, we explore alternative perspectives on challenging topics, ranging from love, sex, death, and madness to dream work, breath work, and other cutting-edge healing modalities. We live on a precipice as a species, so let's jump in. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side of Things. One of the things I've been most passionate about for most of my life, since I can remember, is about the other side of things. And when I say the other side of things, it's not only the other side of this world, it's many traditional cultures might call the other world, but also the different perspectives on any situation. And for those who've been tuning into my other podcast, Musitations with the sound healing, or the first episode in The Other Side of Things, where we talk about paradox and madness and love and death. These are big topics that in our mainstream culture really get lost in terms of the subtlety and nuance and the different perspectives that we might bear on that. And the new book I'm working on, I coined the word, someone else may have used it, but it's really simply saying what psychosis is. Since psyche originally meant soul, I call it Soulchosis in this new book called Souling. And so I am so thrilled to have a friend, a dear, I consider a mentor and fellow journeyer on the way, Ron Bassman. And Ron and I met, we were just talking about it back probably 2005 or 2006. And he reached out to me regarding the beginning of the preparation for publishing an extraordinary book, A Fight to Be, a psychologist's experience from both sides of the locked door. And this book is one of my favorite to recommend to people. I'd love to see it turned into a movie one day. It's such a moving memoir of a very challenging and difficult experience, which I'm going to let Ron talk a bit about. But I want to introduce him to you through one of the things that he writes about himself. And I just, these two small paragraphs to me say so much about who he is. And so this is in Ron's words. My ascent from madness to my present state of clarity and self-acceptance was and is a journey whose responsibility always resided within me. However, as I try to describe and share with others what wisdom I acquired to aid them in their own work, I acknowledge one element that I do not understand or take credit for, something that is named or interpreted according to one's unique beliefs and values as luck, fate, karma, or God's blessings. I believe that as long as a person is alive, some seed of hope, some possibility is there waiting to be fertilized. Hope fights the fear, nurtures the courage, and inspires the vision and the work required to resist giving up. Deep in the recesses of our own being, there are safe sanctuaries, secure hiding places for never fully lost dreams. But sometimes they are so well hidden that we can no longer reach those parts of ourselves. The help we need may come from expected or unexpected sources. So I am going to let Ron kind of take us off from here, from going at the age of 25, being hospitalized and diagnosed as schizophrenic, to becoming an extraordinary advocate, psychologist, author, and the amount of awards this man has won and the kind of things he has done. Two-term president for the National Association of Rights, Protection, and Advocacy. He's been a member of the American Psychological Association's expert task force on serious mental illness. He's also co-founder of the International Network Towards Alternatives for Recovery. So many awards and other things that he's done. And and not to mention, he is a Tai Chi Chuan aficionado and also a lover of sports, in particular, the Detroit Tigers, for whatever reason that is the case. I always love when you share about that, Ron. So without further ado, Dr. Ron Bassman, thank you for being here. It's such a treat to have you.
It's a pleasure, Michael. I'm so glad that we serendipitously had the pleasure of finding each other. And as we were talking, there's a lot of stories about that, but one of the things I share often is that I spent so much time trying to get my book published. There were so many iterations of it. I think I would say I was writing it for about 10 years. It was very, very important to me. And at that time, I met Stuart Miller, who you knew, and he said, "Oh, you should get in touch with Michael DeMaria. You two have so much in common." And we started talking, and you told me that in the indigenous communities, American Indians, or wherever indigenous people still follow their traditions, the belief, I hope I get this right, because it was a long time ago. You said when somebody in the community has something of value to offer, they have no right to hold it back. They got to get it out. And why don't you self-publish?
Mm.
And my wife had been saying that to me for years, just stop sending in to these publishers who say, "Oh, we like what you say, but it's not our thing." In other words, we can't make money off of this. And yours saying that to me was the tipping point, and I just put it together. But, and I share that with people. There are so many people now that I come across that want to write because they've had these extraordinary experiences, which is called psychosis. I prefer madness or an alternative state of reality. And we all have stories to tell. And I think right now there is more receptivity to memoirs, but generally they have to be, kind of purient of somebody who's a celebrity or a famous person. "Oh, you did that, you did this." But we have a lot of stories. Let me tell you about one story that, oh boy, where do I start? I've started a family project, which I'll explain later. But I wrote an article for Mad in America about what I thought needed to be done. And I had a lot of support from the people at Mad in America. They felt like this is something that's really a good thing, and we will back you on this. And I wrote the article, and I got responses from different people. One of the persons I got a response from was a physician from UK, from England. And she described her story to me. She was the daughter of a diplomat. She grew up in various African countries, in Thailand and whatever. And her story goes on to tell how she was damaged by being in boarding school and the kinds of things that happened. Well, she received psychiatric treatment. She received close to 100 electroshock treatments. She was on 33 different kinds of drugs for basically depression and basically not fitting in, which is I guess the most prevalent of reasons why people go into psychosis or have problems. But she was a firm believer in the psychiatric system. She believed that they all meant well and would do good, and she was in and out of hospitals. And during that time, she also got a medical degree. She also had psychosurgery. It's one of the last things. And at the two books that she wrote and published were very well acclaimed. She's a great writer, but it all lauded the treatments in psychiatry that kept her let's say miserable.
Yes.
And then something happened where she woke up maybe about 5, 6 years ago, and she realized that she didn't have good treatment, that she could deal with things in a different way. And she actually met a therapist who was very helpful to her, because nobody was telling her this was part of life. It wasn't a brain disorder, you know, the common thing,
Illness, disorder.
chemical
Yes. Yes.
imbalance. And she wrote a third book, and she couldn't get it published.
Mm.
And because she was critical of psychiatry. And her first two books, she wanted the publisher to take down because she didn't believe it. And they wouldn't take it down because it
Wow.
was still selling.
Wow. Right. Right.
So we
Amazing.
started communicating together. She's a lovely, lovely woman. And she saw the article that I wrote in Mad in America, and somehow it resonated with her. So we started talking. We had some Zoom calls, and we became friendly. And she sent me the manuscript, her next manuscript, the book, and I read it. It was fabulous.
Mm.
But she's still looking to get it published. My last communication with her, she was saying, I'm becoming militant about it. And she's still working in emergency room.
Wow. Wow.
And it's actually, I introduced her to the people who publish and edit Mad in America. So she wrote a piece about the story and geared towards family involvement. So she's just, you know, I hate to use the word poster child, but she was a poster child on one end, but then woke up. And I've seen this over my 50 years working on myself and working with other people, understanding a bit more, but being less dogmatic about what I think.
Yes.
And very grateful that I'm more open now to
Mm.
take in more information, new information, than trumpeting what I do know.
That's
So
beautiful. That's
that's
what's an incredible story. Can you share her name?
it's Kathy Weild, Weild.
Weild, Kathy Weild. Thank you. I'll definitely check out her work. And what an extraordinary story. And it kind of comes into this very powerful message. And I love the title of your book, A Fight to Be. You know, I am, you know, my training, as you know, was at Duquesne University in phenomenological psychology, with a very, you know, the idea of well, The Courage to Be by Rollo May, and you know, and The Fight to Be, I felt was so powerful because your memoir is riveting, and I highly recommend this book to anyone out there. Fight to Be: A Psychologist's Experience from Both Sides of the Locked Door.
Just to
And
interrupt you for a second, Michael.
yes.
A Fight to Be, I had in my mind as the title of the book ever since I started it. Stuart Miller talked to me about, he said, you know, you need to add something onto it because people will think this is a book about fighting or what it,
Right,
you
right,
know,
right, right.
they see it someplace, and that's where a psychologist's experience from both sides
The
of the line.
subtitle came from Stuart. Oh, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, and by the way, the other thing I think I mentioned to you in that first, it was like we just bonded, because for those who don't know, and this new book I'm finally sharing about my grandmother, that my grandmother was hospitalized at, you were 25, I think she was 27, you know, that classic age, you know, of
Let me just correct you. I was first hospitalized. I spent my 23rd birthday in seclusion
23rd.
room in a mental hospital.
Got you. So the 25 was your second, was the
Second,
second hospitalization. Thank you for that correction. And so, right. I mean, I think the connection was I had not met someone who'd really gone through, because you were like, weren't you like the last person in the US to be treated with insulin coma? Is that, do I remember that
very
correctly? Or one of the
close.
last, one of the
Yes.
last?
Quick story about that.
Yes, please.
This is where I first met one of my favorite people who's since passed. He was about 85. His name is Leonard Wright Frank. And I'll give you the little anecdote. I think I write a little bit about this in the book, but I was a executive director of a community mental health center. And I met my future mentor during the meeting where all the directors of the mental health center were talking about what they do for people who are seriously mentally ill.
Right.
And I was not open about my background.
Mm.
And a big fight broke out at this meeting because they had people there who would be called survivors and activists. And the person who was co-leading that meeting, which was supposed to say what the different centers were doing for people with serious mental illness. And I had just been on the job for a couple of months. So I said, I'm just finding my way. But there was a woman there. Her name is Ray Unziger. She's passed also. She became my mentor. And what happened was the person who was directing the meeting was National Alliance for Mental Illness, a NAMI person.
Right.
And one of the survivors at the meeting said something, and the NAMI person looked at her and said, I don't know what you're upset about. You don't look like you're somebody who's schizophrenic. And all fighting started to break out. The only one who made sense was Ray. She talked from a place of experience and also wisdom.
Yes.
And from that time on, she educated me. I lived far away from her. I used to go down to her house. Sometimes I'd bring my son, who was probably about 5 at the time, and she would call herself Auntie Ray for him. She was an Auntie Mame character.
Aww.
But in terms of Leonard and Insulin Shock, she knew my background. She was the first one that, outside of my network of people that knew me from back when, that I told. And I was crying when I told her, and she gave me a big bear hug. And every time I would go down to her house, she would let me have an armload of books. She called it the Fugitive Literature.
I love that. Fugitive Literature.
To the mainstream. But anyway, she invited me to my first NARPA conference, which was out in California. I brought my wife and son, considered it like a holiday. And we were standing in the place where the books were, and Ray said to me, go over and meet that guy there. And I said, well, just go over and introduce myself. And she said, yeah, go ahead. Tell him that you had shock treatment. Tell him that you had electroshock treatment. And I'm looking over, and there's a guy there who was about 6'5" with a long beard and looked like perhaps John the Baptist, who's portrayed. And I walked over and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned around and looked at me, and I said, Ray told me to introduce myself to you and to tell you that I had insulin shock treatment. He said, no. He just lit up. He said, tell me about it. What do you remember? He had an insulin shock treatment.
Right.
He was the first person I met that had it.
Wow.
And Ray went on to do a lot of stuff. And between he and Leonard and Ray, they actually educated me. And that's when I started to come out and reveal my background. And I said, screw the psychologist thing. My God, I'm a psychiatric survivor.
Beautiful.
Most of the knowledge that I have is from that.
Right.
And yes, the training helps, but it's just kind of a cushion for yourself when you work with people that you don't understand, and you give them your evidence-based practice or your formulaic approach, when you really need to give them a part of yourself. In your language, Michael, you have to give them a part of your soul.
Yes, that's beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And it's for me, I have a chapter in this new book called a double agent, being a double agent, because one of the reasons I got into psychology for two reasons. Number one, because I had my own soulchosis at 18. Because of what happened to my grandmother, I stayed away from the psychiatric system. And I had a roommate in college who I always say loved me through it, just literally loved me through it, tending me. And he'd literally hold me and rock me when I was crying or waking up from a dream. Um, and he knew there was something, I was going through some kind of journey, and he would keep notes, and he's my best friend to this day, and he would like journal on what I was going through. And also I read Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which was a figure ground shift for me. And because he talked about his own soulchoses, or extreme states, or what we would call, or what is often called, psychosis. And it was so powerful because here was my grandmother at 27 who was, have all the hospital records. She's not even in a place where this is 1944. She knows she needs help. There's definitely trauma involved. Definitely didn't fit in for both of us. But she's talking about walking on a cloud, and kind of she was having the spiritual actual emergence and not being able to kind of function in consensus reality. And she actually tells the people in the hospital, I know I need some help. But here she is about the time they were importing neuroleptics into this country. And I always like to say, and that during that time, a lot of these neuroleptics were being used as torture in Russia, but they also found they worked as chemical restraint. They made, and so here she
You
was
also
getting,
know, Michael, that they were discovered as an anesthesia.
I didn't know that part actually.
Yeah,
Interesting.
that's what they were first used for.
Yeah. Because I know that she had insulin shock, ECT, and she became catatonic for 7 years, and which we know now was a result of the treatment, and they literally told the family not to visit because it would make her upset. So she spent most of her entire life. There was a few moments where she was able to live outside of the hospital, but she spent, up until, she passed at 81. And so I was, the two things I felt like going to psychology as a double agent, figure out what happened to me and my grandmother, and also to try to be the kind of person I wished had been there for her. And by the way, there was a great story about part of what pulled her out of her extreme state of her catatonia. She was diagnosed catatonic schizophrenic. I don't know if I ever told you this story, but my mother tells it with tremendous, you know, pathos. And by the way, this book emerged out of me. It kind of flowed out of me about 6 months after my mother passed, because my mother asked me not to write about, talk about, or come out of my closet until after my mother died, because she experienced such hurtful stigma. She was raised. She was 11 when her mother was hospitalized, so she grew up in foster homes, and she had a lot of people saying your mother's crazy, or your mother's nuts, and she's in the nut house. And so my mother had a horrible period of time, so she wanted to disassociate from all of that as much as possible. And so we didn't even know. I mean, I had to kind of wrench it out of my mother, because the story was she was just in a nursing home, and she was in the state hospital. So all that to say, I'm really curious where you are today with, you know, what what is psychosis in your current understanding, and understanding the misconceptions, what you might say it really is about or means. And I know there's no definitive answer to this, but also ways of, well, let's just start there. What's your current understanding? And as I say, my current understanding of everything is constantly going under revision every moment of every day.
Good for you.
Right? We're both kind of Taoists, right? So it's that unfolding flow. But I'm curious, because you've been working in this world as a teacher, as an activist, as a therapist, as a guide. So yeah, I'm curious. What is your current understanding? What is this thing we call psychosis?
In 5 minutes or less.
You take as long as you want.
Yeah, I see it as one of the strengths of the human condition.
Mm.
Just as we benefit from diversity, the psychosis is multivariate, and it's not the same from one person to another. What it is a ability for a person who is trapped, unhappy, something maybe traumatized, whatever. And it's kind of like they're searching for a way to feel better in the simplest terms.
Mm.
And because of that, the reality of that person opens up so that they see connections generally. And I'm talking about a stereotypical psychosis because they're so different. But it becomes an opportunity for them to get out of whatever is ailing them, whether it's a personality or not. So when I work with people, I only work with people now who have been in a state of madness, have been hospitalized, and been more or less given up on. And because of my experience, one of the main things that I have to offer is, well, if you can do it, maybe I can do it, that you've been through, and I've seen incredible stories of people who have been through things, but I've also seen people who are stuck, that they can't get out of this, or they don't want to get out of it, that the fantasies of all powerful that comes in often with the problems that people have with madness. Generally, I see psychosis or madness as a search that people do. I think one of Joseph Campbell's analogies in his mythologies, he talks about, let me just think if I get this right, that people who swim in the waters of madness are either mystics or schizophrenic. I hated that, and I read that because it's open to everybody. It's interesting when you think about the work of Viktor Frankl,
Yes.
who was it's controversial, actually, if you look deep into it. There's a lot of questions about the veracity of what he said. But the main thing he said that I think holds water, let's say, is that people have the ability to keep a certain attitude, even if you know you're going to die and walk into the gas chamber. Your attitude towards that is yours. Nobody can take that away from you.
Yes.
When I, just as an aside, when I was receiving insulin treatments, one of the things that I recognized when I was writing was I used to like comic books. And I like to think and feel that I could be the strong comic book character that could never be broken under torture. That I would maintain
Yes.
who I was.
Right.
But I found out, I could be broken.
Yeah.
You
We
know,
all can. We all can.
yeah.
Cool hand Luke aside. I still love that
So,
movie.
I think if I could explain something else about madness that I think is really important is there's such a diversity of people. Some people do well not having social relationships, but it's not a lot of people.
Yeah.
Depending on the personality, and especially with the way we look at now the autistic spectrum of neurodiversity. We're all different, and what will work with one person may not work with another. But we have the capacity to define our own reality.
Mm.
And whether that's real because other people validate it, that, yeah, this is right, this is red, it's not black or green, that's one thing. But in the midst of psychosis, I would argue, as long as somebody would argue with me, it's not red, it's green. And you
Mm.
can't prove otherwise because I
Right.
see that.
Right.
It's not I'm making that up.
Right.
So working with people generally, it's the social relationships that are going to do the most. Um, I like to kid around, and a lot of people don't like this term. Um, I see therapists in many ways as paid friends,
Mm. Yeah. Sure.
and it's very difficult to equalize the relationship so it's from one person to another. But the closer you get to it being an equal relationship where you relate to that person the way they understand and you understand and come to some kind of bond of trust, that's one avenue that may help. The other one is, the idea of a friend, like you said, when you were in college, that was uh, probably the best thing that could happen.
Absolutely. Yes.
And for me in my journey, I had one friend when I was completely out of it. I had no memory. I was living in my parents' three-room apartment, and I was just inert. He would come over and drag me out of the house, and I couldn't remember any of our mutual friends, but he made me do that, and
Mm.
I knew it was through love and kindness, so I
Mm.
would go, but I had nothing to say. I couldn't recognize people that I knew, but he just stuck there. And he wasn't educated, he wasn't a psychologist. He was just somebody who cared about me. And providing that, whether it's a family or a friendship or a spouse, these are the things that offer that bridge into being able. And last time I spoke to you, you talked about living in two worlds. That's the
Yes.
bridge that
Yes.
it, and
That's beautiful. Yeah, I call it in the book, I call it soul friends, developing a soul friendship. And I even talk about the difference between a soul friend, a soul doula, a soul midwife, and a soul guide that are we all kind of need at different points in time. But I love all that. I do. I seem to remember that Joseph Campbell quote. The way I remember it is the mystic swims in the same waters that the madman drowns. Um,
exactly.
and for me, what have tried to do myself is teach people two languages. And Jung said this, that we all live in two worlds. The challenge is, there's the consensus reality, and I in the new and I talk about, actually, in the book, I talk about the wild child, and then the civil child. And the civil child is our ego, but the wild child is the soul. That the soul is a child of nature, and that psychosis or madness, extreme states, are almost like a mutiny of the soul, or a fever of the soul. And fevers are there to actually try to create, like you said, the creative access or resource. And there's some really, that it's a journey you're undertaking. It's almost like an underworld shamanic journey. And if you can have someone who can, another way I like to talk about it is psychosis is a waking dream. The person is actually in this waking dream state, so it's very symbolic. It's very, and there is, the soul is trying to work something out, but it's breaking with consensus reality to try to go back to a more primary way of reorganizing whatever energies or struggles or difficulties. So I'm right. I agree with you. I love that you talk about it as a capacity and a strength, and it is this creative opportunity. It's interesting. One of my native teachers, when I told him about my soulchosis, was, he said, "Oh, well, your soul was trying to initiate itself without any elders around." And I loved that, and it made such sense to me. And that, in other cultures, or soul, what one of my teachers, friends, colleagues, Bill Plotkin, calls soul centric communities, you'd be having some kind of soul initiation between 13 and 25, where you would be, because even in indigenous cultures, people develop an ego, but during a rite of passage, you're reconnecting with your primary sense of soul, which they would say is kind of like, my native teacher said, on my vision quest 30 years ago was, your parents gave you this name, Michael DiMaria, but you're going to go out and become, he was formerly known as Michael. And I'm going to introduce you to your real mother and father, Mother Earth and Father Sky. And they're going to call you by your true name. And I got, these chill bumps, and it was like, it just made such sense to me, because I was going into this very, for lack of a better word, extreme mystical state, but also was a container for and an elder who was helping guide me through this dissolution of ego. And
Let me ask you a
and
question
yeah.
about that. What made you trust him? Assuming it was a man.
Yeah, well, it's a fairly long story, but I'll try to abbreviate it. And I tell it for the first time. May make me a little emotional, because I've been concerned that, number one, people think I'm crazy or I'm lying, and also so deeply sacred. Um, we literally dreamed of each other. I actually had done a shamanic journey with the Foundation for Shamanic Studies with Michael Harner, and I was given the message I was to do this vision quest. And then I was told to do this, what's called a sunbeam divination, which was in this altered state of consciousness, seeing a sunbeam land on a part of the planet. And it landed in this northwest part of the country. And I didn't know anyone. This is 1993. There's no internet. There's no, you know, it, and I was like, I asked the person who was guiding me, how do I find what I'm to do with it? I didn't even know what a vision quest was. I start calling outfitters in and around this area. And everybody I called, anything about a vision quest, they would hang up on me or say, I do fishing trips or hunting trips. It was like the last person on the list I called, and I said, do you know anything about a vision quest? And he said, hold on a second. And I heard him go, this is back with what, landlines. So I can tell he goes to the back room and he asks somebody in the front room to hang up the phone. And he goes, who is this? And I said, I'm Michael DiMaria. I'm a psychologist in Florida. I was told I was to do a vision quest in this part of the country. And he goes, I don't know anything about vision quests. I guide hunting and fishing trips into the national forest, but I have a native teacher who does teaching stories for my folks who come and for the participants. And he just pulled me aside the other day and said, I had a dream about guiding a white guy on a vision quest. I almost dropped the phone. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. The other synchronicities. I said, well, how do I get in touch with him? He says, well, he doesn't have a phone. I'll talk to him. It was like a 6-month process. I had to call him at a pay phone where he was at, and it was a 6-month process of trusting him. And even then, I
Do
mean,
you remember? Do you remember when you first encountered him, the feeling that you got?
oh my gosh. Yeah, it was, I like can feel it right now. I mean, another teacher of mine, Malidoma Patricia May, would call them truth bumps, or he'd call it truth bumps are a breeze from the other world. Malidoma would call it. Malidoma was one of the ones who'd said, and he came to this country and went into a lot of the different locked wards. And he was famously known to say, why do you lock up all of your shamans and medicine people? you know, and he was the one who told me, 2% of our culture is diagnosed schizophrenic or severe mental illness, and 2% of indigenous cultures are shamans or, medicine people. And they call it bumping into the other world. And at that point, you were then trained with other people who had learned to live between the worlds, who had that capacity. because not everybody could raise somebody who bumped into the other world, you know. And another way of talking about that, like I'm convinced, Ron, that I have whatever my grandmother had, but I consider it high sensitivity, or I should say exquisite sensitivity. I don't think of it as a problem. Deep empathy, and to indigenous cultures, empathy and extreme sensitivity are signs of deep intelligence and intuition, and also a very kind of naturally imaginative, creative, or what we might call mystical consciousness. And I think I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, but I've been very successful over 30 plus years in my practice working with those people that everybody else gave up on. And although I'm not practicing anymore, I can those who had these extreme states were so bright, intelligent, compassionate, empathic, sensitive, and highly creative, and people oftentimes they were ideal students growing up, or they had high achievers, or outcasts, or not fitting in. But I have come to honor and see that it's like our culture's misunderstanding. We live in an extroverted thinking culture. So to be introverted, intuitive, and feeling oriented is, uh, especially intuitives, it might be shifting. It is shifting and changing a bit. Don't have a place. And I think that's a huge challenge. But yes, I remember feeling a sense of immediate connection, and he would then call me nephew, and he was, it was a very deep connection. And there were things he ended up telling me about myself and my life that he had no other way of knowing. um, Many indigenous cultures really honor their dreams in a deep, deep way. And in some indigenous cultures, the most important thing you do for each other is help you manifest your dreams. And they mean their literal waking night dreams. They're not just talking about your egoic dreams. They're talking about, if you had this dream of going to this place and finding this shell or this stone, it was the rest of the tribe, would do that. And, they would paint their dreams on their teepees, or it was a very rich, soul centric kind of life.
You reminded me of a number of things, and I don't want to spill out,
No,
just,
please, wherever you want to go.
just there's so many things. The first thing that I would say is the intuition, the reliance on feelings and the perceptions of a 3, 4, 5-year-old is generally denied because they see
Yes,
things that,
100%.
excuse me?
100%.
Yeah. So I think that creates a channel where a person can develop a mistrust for what they see. And I think when you feel something, that's why I asked you what you felt about the person you were talking
Yes.
about.
Yes.
I've reconnected at times with stuff that I feel was lost in terms of intuitive feelings and recognizing when somebody was not, many things, not a good person, or was dissembling information, telling you stuff that didn't work. And there, for me personally, because I think everybody's journey is different, I think I lost sight when I was very young of who I was, and needed to conform in certain ways, but never was really able to conform. And I was able to get by. But then there came a part of my life where I was just so unhappy and unintegrated into who I was that I needed to do something to escape from that.
Mm.
And whatever switch I turned changed how I perceive things. And where people who have an alternate state of reality, whether it's a vision or whatever it is, get in trouble is when they tell other people. They
Exactly.
proselytize.
Yes.
You know, and you know, there's so many things around this that we do wrong as a society, a culture, that it's very difficult for a gifted, unusual, somebody who has different, can sense things differently. I've had a few experiences in my adult life where I came across people who were different. And I remember meeting and going to a Zen ashram, and the Roshi, the leader, came out. You know, I think I was spending 3 or 4 days there studying with him, and he came out and he walked out for I think it was called Seishin, where he would respond to questions from the group. And immediately when I saw him, I said, I trust this person with my life. Nothing
Wow.
what it said, just what emanated.
Right. Right. It
And
was a
I,
feeling.
yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things that are most helpful for people is to see possibilities and to see understanding, that somebody understands what their journey has entailed with the pain and whatever, and to believe that they could get to a different place. And the place I see where I am within that is to help a person get over the bridge.
Mm.
I'm part of the bridge, and I allow people to use me to get to the place of understanding where it allows them to get out of this, whatever the crisis is that they've been subjected to, and to recognize that their experience being drugged, diminished, all the things that happen when they go into the hospital and what they have to face when they come out, the revision of their image of themselves and what people think of them. I talk about it as being something you've learned.
Mm.
It's a specific experience that you'll understand in a way that possibly nobody else will understand, but you can use that instead of being stuck on that bridge between who you are and what people have maneuvered you into being.
Mm.
So it's a complicated process. Let me tell you about the project that I'm working on now.
Yes, please, please.
I believe, I started thinking about this probably about 15, 20 years ago, and I wrote an article about it with 2 other people. And it's the idea that there would be less people that were subjected to the kinds of things that many people are subjected to try to get them to change, to be more passive in their roles. And I felt like working with families, and I'll give you the outline of the project. It's develop a curriculum for families, which would be multifamily groups. And the curriculum would be to train facilitators in how to support somebody who is outside of what the family wants them to be, not send them to the family physician. Hey, Joe's acting kind of weird, we're scared of
Right.
whatever's happening.
Right.
Well, in a multifamily group run by a facilitator who has a whole curriculum that disavows the kinds of things that people are told. Your son or daughter has a biochemical disorder, and the only way they can function is by giving them some medication. They need to work on a low stress job, and they'll probably be in and out of hospitals for the rest of their lives. Well, educating a group of families and also having the facilitator understand this process. And I've got probably 25 people that want to be facilitators right now
Beautiful.
for
Oh, that's
training.
exciting. Exciting.
And to be able to, not for everybody, but for most people, the typical trajectory for young people is to go away. They were a star in high school, they're very bright, and go away to college, and they start experimenting with different things. We start thinking about infinity, reality, and different stuff. We smoke some cannabis, now with the psychedelics. And some people, just enter into a state that they don't know how to get out of,
Right.
and,
Exactly.
and having an understanding and supportive family will help, but that family alone will have difficulty sustaining that. But if they're in a
Yes.
group with other families that understand, they can support each other, offer suggestions. Plus, what we're going to develop is a curriculum with resources to get rid of the notion the person's going to be that way for the rest of their lives, and
Beautiful.
introduce speakers to come in who have been through things, and family
Beautiful.
members. So we've been meeting. We have a group of 10 people meeting now for probably, it's been several months now. And we're putting together a package. And the first thing we're going to do is invite a number of people, both in focus groups and large groups, to tell what was helpful, what was hurtful when they were encountering these situations, what they needed, what would have helped them, and how do we make this stuff available? We're starting with a pilot project for one family, maybe two, to go out and do this. And we're going to be, we have two very competent researchers that have offered their time to do this because they're
Wow.
interested in it.
Beautiful.
So this is kind of my swan song that I'd like to
Oh, that's
get
beautiful.
done.
So what is the name of this project, or do you have one yet?
Safe,
Safe.
survivors and families empowered.
Wow. Survivors and families empowered. Safe. This is so exciting. And I can see how it brings together things like open dialogue. I mean, for those who don't know, in
That's
Lapland,
exactly one of the principles we'll
yeah,
be using, open dialogue and the
yeah.
principles from Satyria.
And for those who don't know how effective open dialogue in Lapland of Scandinavia have they pretty much have eliminated hospitalization for psychosis, and it's working with the families. And by the way, I found working with families was critical when I was really helping people, and I had so many I've had those success cases where people who were in and out of hospitals and diagnosed chronic schizophrenic or bipolar or whatever, and through this particular process of working with the families and paradigm, stepping out of that paradigm, and also working with a lot of other things from nutrition and like we talked about, we both love things like Tai Chi, Qigong, or yoga, that they've gone on to be successful. One went to Yale Divinity School, another, a number have gotten PhDs in psychology, another is a fantastic successful in the medical field. And every one of them, their families or doctors had told their families they would be chronic cases in and out of hospitals and have to be on medication the rest of their lives. None of them medication, and everyone was very different, unique. And as you said, I think that's a really big part of it. But, I remember back when I was also teaching, at the university level, advanced personality theory and others, I always used to love teaching about Sutira and also Artie Lang and just a lot of different kinds of madness in the family and how these different, and we've evolved a lot. There's more subtleties that can be used, and no one, has all the answers. But I think this sense of what you're talking about, connection and community, two things I tend to say so often, which you've hit on, which I'd love to hear, how this figures in for you too. I love to say insanity is nothing more than invalidated experience, and sanity is nothing more than good editing. You know, it's like what to say to whom when. And the other is it, I found often, I worked on locked units, adolescent units, adult units for years, and unit psychologist and ran groups and did the testing and so often if I could, the very things I was taught, don't enter into the psychosis, blah, 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 blah. But so often, I always said I never met a hallucination or delusion that wasn't chock full of meaning, that it was a bit like a waking dream. And by the way, some of this newest neuro research, a couple fascinating things have come up, which is, up until the age of 6, most children are in a theta state while they're awake, which means that the theta is our dream state. And we also, another way you could say it is the veil is thin, but the default mode network, which is removed during psychedelics, it's removed while we're dreaming, it's removed or it's not there when we're, because I was trained as a child psychologist, so working with kids in those states, but also in psychosis. I haven't seen the studies with people in psychosis, but my guess is that default mode network is also off a lot more. And so they're in kind of primary process, during the day. And that's what, if I can get families to say, well, if you just imagine they're in a dream state and they don't know it, and let's be able to teach them 2 languages. So often, if I could let the person know, they're naked, refusing to put clothes on in the hospital, on the floor, refusing to go down for dinner, get clothes on. And instead of having some huge episode, I'd sit down and they would start telling me, whatever their particular quote delusion was. And when I dealt with it like a dream with tremendous curiosity, I can say, well, as soon as I would give them a sense of humanity and look at them as a person with love and consideration, and that they were seeing and in touch with something that they could be my teacher, the madness often would drop away. The next thing was usually like, oh, well, can you get me out of here? As soon as that would happen. And then I'd say, well, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what, if you could put some clothes on, let's go get something to eat and talk about it. And they'd go beeline, put their clothes on, and we'd have a great conversation without the madness that was actually creating this pushing away. And so I think that I saw in open dialogue, for those interested, there's some good little documentaries out there about open dialogue, and I love what you're doing with Safe. And it also reminds me, intentional peer support and Hearing Voices Network, and these other resources. And I'm curious, what would you say to other people who may not have access to you or to Safe in the US that you really feel are doing really good work, and whether it's in the consumer or survivor networks, what are some of the places you'd suggest to our listeners who may be struggling, families or individuals, that you really recommend?
It's really a tough question because we, as a nation, maybe a world, focus on control. We try to control things that are not necessarily controllable. And we want a kind of template, especially with computers now. And what, I have a large network of people having done this work for a long time, but many of the people are in pain themselves. And I think, and I get calls from families with terrible stories of what's happened to them. And it's not just in this country. I get them from Europe, I get them from Canada a lot. And I think as I'm talking right now, I'm thinking that we're frightened.
Yes.
We live in a world of preventing something from happening. The big thing right now, I get a lot of research sent to me, and the research is so terrible. And the one area where I see some of the worst correlational research is with Alzheimer's. People are so frightened. That's I think perhaps 100 years ago it was the fear of people who were crazy, acting crazy, inexplicable. Now I see, these ridiculous correlations. If you eat carrots, you won't get Alzheimer's or something. Study of 10 people who ate carrots. I don't even read the stuff. The
Oh,
headlines
it's terrible.
say these things. But I think to have an acceptance of our mortality, to try to make the best of our skills and talents are good. But I think it's the interrelationships that are most healing.
Yes.
I can't say, one of the people that's on my mind is somebody that I've been working with for a while, and a family, and he's just been hospitalized again. I don't know what's going to happen. A lot of times I'm with people, I can't even put a percentage on. Do I have 50% of the people I see? It's kind of being available with whatever I know, and as you get older, if you're lucky, you know more things and don't have as much. Well, I can't say it's just the basis of age, but you don't have as much ego involvement. You recognize more of what you can. If you're lucky, you recognize more of what you can do and what you can't do, and you accept things. Generally, I'll talk to just about anybody who calls me or writes me. And sometimes I can give them information that's helpful about, if, you're in North Carolina, there's a pretty good group down there called Promise that does a lot of good work with peers and stuff. But it depends on the person, whether they're available or they think that they, it was a joke we used to have when I was young, which is kind of cruel now. But there was one of the people who was on the street, lived with his sister, was probably had some intellectual deficits. The kids would used to tease him and say, "You're all right. The whole world is crazy," which is cruel. But, this is what is difficult to get through. I think having somebody truly care about another person and know them and see possibilities will be very helpful. I'm completely against force for any reason whatsoever, because I think that damages future relationships, it damages trust, it damages the family. It's so hard to have somebody get integrated back into a respectful family relationship if they've been tricked or forced or done, and the families get blamed by the person for the terrible things that have happened to them. I remember it took me quite some time to reintegrate with especially my mother, who, did everything she could, but she was an immigrant, uneducated, and to her, the doctor was God. So what he said went.
Sure.
So the place where I don't think we can probably, I don't know, sometimes I think 20% of families are reachable, then I think 40%, to work with. But there are abusive families that we have to recognize. So who we can really do something with working with families is limited too. But I think presenting other opportunities for caring families, there's so many caring families that are out there. One of the things I learned late in my career working with people is if I started to relate with somebody who was a family member who was kind of, so about what is possible, and I talk about what I overcome or whatever, there was such a negative reaction.
Wow.
Uh,
Wow.
Not overt, they didn't say, oh, you're making this up, but
Yeah.
I could feel it. And that was because they had an adult offspring who had that look, with the distended belly, maybe tardive dyskinesia or whatever. And this family member was caring and really wanted to do something positive. And they went down this trail where the only thing they could do was keep increasing the drugs, periodically hospitalized. And this is the part, I think, where right now my feeling is that I can make the biggest input by gathering these kinds of multifamily groups together. Research has showed that it works, and we'll see what happens with it. But in answer to your question, it's kind of open-ended. Generally, I don't talk with the person who's experienced the altered state. It's usually a mother or father calls
Mm.
up, says, and sometimes I'll agree to see the person, and the person's not really interested. I'll see them once or twice.
Right.
And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And may be who I am, but it may be what they're dealing with. It may not
Yes.
be the right timing or whatever. I just had somebody that I saw 2, maybe 3 times, and didn't want to see me anymore. And I didn't know what it was. And his mother told me that he was embarrassed in the condition he was in, and he thought that I was really good at what I was doing, but he couldn't deal with it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
there's just such a variety of reasons. And I can't say that I don't feel hurt or in some ways or disappointed that I can't reach somebody. But I recognize there's a limitation that we have, and it's that person's journey, not mine. I can
Yes.
suggest things, I can look at things, I can relate to them with possibilities as a real person. But that's the best I can do. And I can't have some kind of savior designation for myself.
Amen to that. And that's actually, I appreciate all of that, Ron. And it reminds me, you've been a mentor for me over the years. I have reached out to a few times with some very difficult cases, and one thing you've said a number of times that has really stayed with me, because both my own feeling of failure, like, goodness, this person was like, they've gone 3-4 years without an episode and we're doing great. And all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, they have another episode. And of course, then they get, especially when it's out of my hands, or they end up getting hospitalized again. And then, and then the cycle begins again. And you've said, a number of times to me, Michael, I don't know, but there seems each person has a moment or a time. For most people, that until they're, whatever journey they're on, whenever they've kind of completed whatever they've needed to, when the psychosis either starts to diminish in frequency and intensity, or falls away, and that was really stayed with me. And I've seen that happen,
Did I tell you that you weren't all powerful?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, part of my Soulchosis at 18 was thinking I was Jesus. So I've had a Jesus complex that was
I would
pretty
tell you about
crazy,
that. I
right?
remember. Quick
Yeah.
story. When I was working in New York, I was going around to different hospitals evaluating stuff and also helping them set up self-help groups. And it was this delightful guy that I used to sometimes go to different places with. He was a 6'6" African-American man.
Wow.
And you can't imagine how badly he would be treated when the cops came, when they
I
saw
can imagine.
the
I
threat.
can imagine.
But
Yes.
he was telling me, about when he thought he was as Jesus. And I remember driving with him and I said, "You weren't Jesus. What's wrong with you?" "I was Jesus." There's not more Jesus.
Well, that is a screenplay I want to do one day where 3 or 4 Jesuses all, it may have been done somewhere, but all are in the psych unit and the conversation they have, about who's really Jesus. But my meditation teacher, actually, who's been a dear mentor, and he was the one who, between my best friend, Bill, and then this teacher is also called Bill, who's not well at the moment, but he's been a meditation teacher for me, and for 42, 33 years, but dear friend, colleague, mentor, and he was also a Buddhist psychologist, and he taught me to meditate during that period of time. And he was the one who introduced me to the concept, when I was telling him all this, and he could have had me hospitalized. He could have all kinds of things he could have done. And he said, excellent. He said, of course, you're literally not Jesus, but you have tapped into Christ consciousness. What a miracle. What an extraordinary experience. And that figure ground shift. So he wasn't demonizing, he wasn't pathologizing, but he was humanizing, actually, but also kind of gave a sense of, but it's, this is just a bell and whistle of your waking process. And
It was genuine.
very genuine. And he really, I talk about him in the book as my first kind of soul guide, that kind of, he'd been further down the path, and he was able to see me and validate this extreme state of consciousness, and he definitely lived between the worlds. He was friends with Ram Dass, and he certainly had done his psychedelics in his day, but it was profound. It was a figure ground shift for me. But 2 things before we finish up. The first was I wanted to mention that, in addition to Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Jung, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning also helped save my life at 18. No two ways about it. The other one was Carl Rogers, when they asked him towards the end of his life, why he felt this client-centered therapy worked. Like, you're not really doing anything. Why, how, and why does it work? I mean, we're not arguing that you're not successful with people. And I'll never forget his response. And he kind of paused and he said, at some moment, the therapist genuinely, authentically, humanly loves the client. And it's when the client experiences that and knows that to be true that healing happens.
2 things I'll say. One of my favorite book titles that I always, some point along the way in therapy, I mention this to somebody, not to read the book, but the title is by Carl Rogers and Barry Stevens, and it's called "Don't Push the River."
Yes.
That expresses it so well.
Yeah.
The other thing that occurred to me as we were talking, I don't know if you're familiar with Windhorse, which is a residential community run on Zen principles that was basically founded on the work of Ed Podval, who was a psychiatrist who was a Zen Buddhist. And in his book, what is it called? Something with Reclaiming Sanity, I believe. The most poignant thing that he wrote, and I feel resonates the most, is, and I've seen it over and over again, within madness, there's always aisles of clarity that you can tap in and find a place where you can reach somebody. Just like he did with the person who wouldn't put his clothes on.
Yes.
And I've seen, this so often. There's always, if it's the right time, a place where you can get through, and all the
Noise.
crazy associations, noise, that you're actually reaching the person. That's, to me, one of the beauties of the work we do. If we can do it.
Yeah.
And it's a belief in possibilities. When you read that piece, when you started talking, that I've written. I don't know where that came from. You know, that was a lot of my writing was kind of, I'd sit down and something would come to me and be inspired. It might be a paragraph or two, but you gave me chills, you know, almost like, you know, I hadn't written it. It's just every time I come to that, and people pick out that piece of things, and I don't know where it came from. It
Well,
comes from
it's
someplace.
yeah, it so touched me, and I'm glad you brought that back up because as you were talking about finding that place, that sanctuary, or that connection, or that harbor within the madness, the storm, I was going right back to that, and it I remember being moved to tears when I first read that of yours, and it reminds this is a place I would really love to land. I have been completely entranced by the painting of the ocean that has nothing, in back of you, that there's no boat, it's just the ocean. And one of my dearest friends,
Are you talking about the picture on the wall over there?
yes, yes, behind you.
My father-in-law painted that.
Really, really, I absolutely love it, and I have one very similar. So this was a dear man. His name was Hugh Carter. His soul name, he would come into my kivas and all the soul work stuff I did, and his soul name he had was Pilgrim. He had been a Presbyterian minister his whole life, and when he uh, when he retired, he just started seeking and became a spiritual seeker of like all. He was really interested in the Tao, and towards the end of his life, he lived to be 88, and he was just a wise elder, and this sense of open-heartedness. And it's interesting, I hadn't thought about this till just this moment, but he had spent one of his best friends was this woman who he talked to like virtually every day for 30 years, who was quote schizophrenic, and they had just developed this friendship and connection. But a few weeks before he transitioned, I like to say, to the other side of things versus, just passing, I went into his bedroom and he had a painting like that over his bed. And I said, Hugh, I'm just so entranced by that picture because it's just the ocean. There's nothing figural. It's just the waves and the ocean. And he goes, I want you to have it, Michael. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, I get nothing but grief about that. Everybody says, why do you have a painting of just water? He, he said, there's no boat, there's no person, it's just open water. And he goes, it's one of my favorite paintings because it reminds me of the vastness that we're swimming in all the time. He had this belief that, when we died, he'd always tell me, he goes, I can't tell anyone from my parish this, but I want to tell you a secret. I think when we die, we merge with God, and it's like, and that painting reminds me of that. And so I have it. It's down at my office, and I just want to bring coming back to this thing of that the shaman or the mystic swims in the same ocean the madman drowns. What we're saying there is that, hey, at least the madman found the ocean. And what if we decided to just give him swimming lessons instead of, telling him to get out of the water,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's a good one. I like that.
Yeah. And I think that's what people, those who have learned to swim in those rough waters like us have, that's I think what may be different when we meet someone in those waters is we may even can celebrate they're in the water and help them, swim as opposed to get out of the water.
Well, I'm not sure if I wrote this or where I wrote this, but my take on that was personal in the sense of I was frolicking in the water of madness
Yes.
when I was dragged out against my
Yes.
will.
Yes.
When whether I was going to drown, I don't know. Maybe I would have swam, but I was enjoying it.
Yes.
And I think um, that's the different levels of psychosis or madness. You know, it can be very painful for a lot of people. It can vacillate between being extremely enjoyable and then be painful and move back and forth.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
the idea of pulling somebody out of the state that they're in has to be damaging.
100%. And actually, I did want to mention this because I'm right there with you about being against forceful incarceration or hospitalization. I often feel my grandmother was a political prisoner, you know. Um, you're part of mind freedom. And before we finish, can you share a little bit about mind freedom? Because I love getting the emails and do my best to also write and support people being involuntarily committed.
Well, I was working for a while as executive director when the founder, David Oakes, had a serious accident where he was paralyzed.
Mm.
And I think I probably did that for several years, but it was just, yeah, it was a disappointment for me because I couldn't really pull it together in terms of did a lot of great work at Mind Freedom, a lot of supporting of people, and they still do. There's just no staff. It's
Yeah,
all volunteer,
right.
and there was a bookkeeper, and everybody was devoted to what they were doing. But because there was no, it wasn't mainstream, and that we couldn't get funding. Applied for
Right.
a lot, wound up getting a little bit of funding from people who made donations, and one person left a trust. I had spoke to him while he was in hospice, and that kept us going for a while. But it just I still support mind freedom. I'll do what I can sometimes, depending on what it is. And I started, which is still going on, it's called Judy's Room, which was named
Yes.
Judy's Chamberlain. And it's a coordinated effort with a group called I Love You, Lead On, which are the words of Justin Dart, considered the father of the disability movement. But the idea was to build a connection and have a mutual understanding between people who had the traditional, the typical disabilities, hearing, eyesight, movement, with the people who had mental health challenges, to understand and how to work together as informationally, and someday may even be able to have a kind of power base. It's still going on. It's I think it's about the second year. And we would invite people in from different expertise, deal with some of the issues of drug withdrawal, what it meant, what the drugs did to you. And on the disability side, it would be the dangers of conservatorships, guardianships, how to protect yourself. And there was a lot of good stuff. We had a couple of movies that were shown by people who had made them. And actually, it was interesting because we scheduled it for 2 hours the first Wednesday of each month. It was 4 o'clock Mountain Time, 6 o'clock Eastern Time. There's not one this month, but it'll continue because of the holidays. It was interrupted. So I'm still involved, but not directing at this point. We've had some really good people talking about the dangers of 988, the new way of
Yes.
tracking people. And
Yes.
there's some tough stuff out there, and
Yeah.
especially anybody who shoots up a place. Yeah, they're a little crazy to do that, but we're not going to track everybody who has been involved with something with mental illness as a potential danger of becoming a shooter and
Oh
all
my
other
gosh.
stuff.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's protecting the rights of those. And Yeah, that could be a whole nother podcast we could do. But I've always enjoyed receiving information on mind freedom. I love the title mind freedom and the idea that the main and Judy's room, and that the main upshot is a a resource information on those who are trying to fight against involuntary hospitalization.
Yeah, and anybody who listens to this, if they're interested in mind freedom, it's just one word, mindfreedom.org, and they'll have um, previous Judy's rooms that are cataloged, and we'll invite how to sign up for the next one if you're interested. I don't know what next month's is going to be, but they're usually and they're free. So
Well, I always enjoy getting the emails, even when I can't attend. It just that it exists, period. Even though it doesn't have the resources yet that we hope it would have one day, and same with the Hearing Voices Network. But I'm looking forward to part of the main purposes of this podcast. In addition, a lot of things I want to talk about with our death phobic, griefy literate culture is a whole nother main section. But having other guests on to talk about this really important way of looking at extreme states or madness from a very different lens, and from a very different paradigm. And you've been our lead off for this
oh, really?
section
I
part
didn't
of it.
know. So
Yeah, and
glad
I
to.
I couldn't think of a better person for that, Ron. And
Well, thank you, Michael. It's
yeah,
always good talking with you, whether it's public talk or just private talk.
absolutely. No, it's such a joy. And I really want to thank you not only for your personal journey, but for sharing your journey. That one of the things when I said was when we first talked about your book, and yes, that you had a responsibility, but also I remember my native teacher saying, "What makes you think your story is yours? It
Yeah.
belongs to the community." And I think that was the other thing I mentioned. And also, you've been an inspiration for me, because it was easy for me to tell you that, but this book that I'm actually struggling with, that I need to share with you at some point, because I'd love you to return the favor of an endorsement if you're so inclined, because I'm now coming out of the closet, the survivor closet. But it's less that I'm, because I'd never entered the psychiatric system, that I'd say coming out of the closet as I say I'm an equal opportunity. I've experienced depression, suicidality, psychosis, mania. I've you just name it, I've experienced it. But as another book I'd love to write one day is an N of one, that the N of one counts, which is the case studies. My dissertation, I always like to say, didn't have one statistic in it. It was all case studies. And I think that was another thing that Rogers said, was case studies keeps the the discipline of psychology honest, because it's so easy to get statistics to lie. But when you talk about our personal stories and first person lived experience, and that's what you do both in your book and in your writing and your advocacy. And I want to thank you for your tireless work on I- you hear about neurodiversity, and I identify as neurodivergent, but I would like to also see us talk about psychodiversity and being psychodivergent, that honoring this
How would
difference.
that look?
I don't know. I have no idea. But the idea that, hey, listen, just because Jung said an interesting, another thing he said was that as you become more whole, two things happen. One, you appear more eccentric because you're not following the herd in consensus reality. You're following the beat of your own drummer. Number two, you become more androgynous because you're beginning to develop your masculine, your yin and your yang, which you'd like this as a Taoist. So for me, psychodiversity is honoring our own individual, unique, one of a kind, from an indigenous perspective, soul print, which is one of a kind. And when we can wear our Soulchosis flag with pride, as opposed to some sense of stigma, or if there's something wrong with me, rather, hey, wait a minute, I'm psychodiverse. I'm I've experienced a Soulchosis. Now, the idea of, as Stan Groff said, the idea of being a difference between a spiritual emergence and a spiritual emergency is that one is less problematic because the person's navigating it more successfully. And that has everything, a lots to do with, privilege and resources. And my grandmother was in poverty. She didn't have supportive family. She wasn't educated. So that's why she ended up in the hospital. There was another thought. That you hear this sometimes. The difference between eccentricity and madness is the amount of money you have. you know,
Unless you're a woman.
unless you're a woman, 100%, 100%.
Yeah. Mind freedom, for years when David Oakes was running it, would have a Mad Pride
That's
protest.
right. That's right. I forgot about that. Mad Pride. Yeah.
Yeah. I would suggest to anybody to go look at the website. It may not be as polished as the websites can be, but if it's still on there, there's a picture of one of the demonstrations with people holding up signs. Mad Pride is also, Mind Freedom has an affiliate in Ireland. They do a Mad Pride Ireland, and I think there was one that just sprung up, and forgetting where it was, but every late spring or early summer, there's something with that. The other thing that I would recommend, that when I first came on to Mind Freedom, there was two things that were done. One was, I think it was 9 or 10 videos about interviews with people who had been activists on different subjects. That's still, I think, on the front page. And then there was an organizer's handbook that we developed, which talked about the different resources, how to avoid being persecuted, prosecuted, whatever. But the organizing book is online. You can find it from the link on. And then we printed up a bunch of them so that people who were in the hospital could get a copy if they wanted it. So there's some really good resources on there for people.
Absolutely. No, thank you for reminding and sharing that, because I just love the phrase mind freedom, and
Yeah.
it's huge. One of the big reads I had this last year was The Dawn of Everything, towards a new history of humanity, and two anthropologists. And one of the things they've discovered within a lot of indigenous cultures, particularly that existed for, from what we know, for tens of thousands of years, but in particularly North America, that there were three freedoms that were valued above all others: the freedom to say no, the freedom to move, and the freedom to change. And
Excellent.
right? And you think about that, we don't have those freedoms.
No.
Freedom to say no, the power of the freedom to say no, the freedom to move, and the freedom to change. I just love that. That was the takeaway from it's a tome. It's quite the book, but it's very well researched.
Yeah.
But I know we're coming to an end, and I just I truly, I tell people, information and knowledge is all over the place in this information revolution, but wisdom is in very short supply. And I consider you a wise teacher and elder.
It'll
And
make me blush.
well, but also remember, as a Taoist, I also see that in Shakespeare, the wisest one was also the fool. The one that could make fun of the king had to do so from a place of. So I always say, on the medicine wheel, the east direction of the medicine wheel is considered the place of the sacred fool and the wise elder, and that they're very kind of synonymous. But you have I really feel honored to have your wisdom on this, this really beginning of the series on, I'm going to call it probably soulchosis, just because I like to play with the word. And, but I love you also reimagining and re-owning the word madness in a beautiful way. It makes me think of Plato's Thea mania, which is divine madness. He would say madness can be a blessing if it's seen as a gift from the divine, which is about context, which is also something that we lose in our culture. But I hope we'll have you back on at some point, and
Sure,
if
anytime
you're
would be
open to
great
it.
too. I
And
enjoy talking with you. It makes me think of things that I thought that I forgot.
yes, likewise. And before anything else you'd like to leave the listeners with, either how to find you, your book, information on your work, and any other last words of wisdom to our listeners?
Well, I have a website that unfortunately I neglect a lot of time, but when I have a new article that I've written or something that's going on, I put that on there. And articles that are published, I generally put under articles, and they're all free. Um, just you can get to know me somewhat by looking at my website. And the book is, I originally put the website up to promote the book, and the same thing is up there, and I talk about, although I should change it some as it evolves, but I have what I do as a therapist. Sometimes I have a great video up on Justin Dart. For anybody who doesn't know who Justin Dart is, just do a Google search. I was very privileged to know him and attend his memorial service, where all the bigwigs in Washington attended, including Bill Clinton and secretaries of state. He is the acknowledged father of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was recorded for what is it? It's CNN. I get the initials mixed up, but the recording's on there. I posted it. I have some posting. I've done a posting of a sort of a presentation by me and Joanne Greenberg, who wrote I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. She likes to tease me. So that video's up. We did a presentation in Massachusetts, which we were doing individual presentations, but then we started to talk together. People say they like it, So I got a hodgepodge of things up there that look at, and also you can get in touch with me through the website if you want. So that's probably the best way. You could find my website just putting my name in. It's www.ronaldbassman.com.
And I will be putting links to all of that in the description and in the description of our podcast, which will be both on YouTube and on our anybody's favorite podcast platform. So, Ron, 1,000 thank yous for being here, and
You're very welcome. It was great when I saw you in person when you came to Boulder. We had lunch together.
Such a treat. We're going to have to do that again. I hope to get back up there in the next year or so, and always a treat to be with you. And I look forward to many more Soulversations in the coming years.
And good luck on the podcast. I think it'll be very much appreciated by people who tune into it.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks again for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in to The Other Side of Things. I have been your host and guide, Dr. Michael DeMaria. You can find out more about my work at michaeldemaria.com. Explore the books, music, and online programs and films. And we'll see you next time on The Other Side.